other people to join. We're still missing one of our panelists, but I think given the time is ticking, we'll get started. So hello everyone, and thanks a lot for joining us today. I definitely see a lot of familiar names on the participants list, so that's really nice. Great, welcome everyone. And if this is your first contact with the RCCs, doubly welcome and nice to have you today. So just a quick introduction about RCC Kampala. We were set up in 2013 to support countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. And we have 4 staff. It's me, I'm the new regional lead since March 2020. My name is Suri Muse. Previously, I was in Bonn supporting the MEF panel, the accreditation panel, executive board, and also Article 6 negotiations. Then you probably know Ritah, who's more familiar face. She's the technical officer with us. Then there's Sana, our UNV climate change specialist, and also Brenda, our assistant. And they've all got a part to play today, so you'll hear a little bit from each of them in due course. So the original mandate for the RCC was to increase participation in the CDM, but in the last couple of years, this mandate has shifted, and we're also working on NDCs, MRV, adaptation, enhanced transparency framework, and also climate finance. So mainly our work is to be a conduit between the Secretariat in Bonn and also the regions, kind of to demystify the UNFCCC processes and to provide capacity building in the areas mentioned to you. And in that sense, this webinar is a really good example of that. One of our speakers today is Gaj from Bonn, who will talk about the application of SBs for other uses. And we also have others on the line from Bonn, whose expertise we can draw on. So why in particular this webinar? This is the first webinar that we're doing since COVID lockdown started. And for those not familiar, life in Kampala has not quite returned to normal the way it has in some places. Normally we'd be out there meeting face to face and organizing events or participating in physical events, but obviously given the restrictions on meetings and travel, we're meeting under this new format. We have, and one particular SBs, we've seen here in Uganda, for example, the green school numbers that has applied SBs, and also there's other examples from the regions. And this has also been a topic in recent MP meetings and also at EB 105. So we felt that these other uses for SBs are kind of underutilized, and there's this untapped potential that we wanted to spread the word on. So just a couple of housekeeping issues. First of all, we'll be using this tool called Mentimeter. So it's best if you have another display handy, maybe like your telephone, or if you have another screen, and you can navigate there now to menti.com. I'll do the same, and we'll all be on the same page at the same time. So for now, once that loads, you'll see you have to enter a code, and we'll give you that code in a moment. So I'm going to use it on my telephone. And yeah, with this tool, it allows us to ask you questions and solicit kind of answers from the participants. And we'll also be using this to take your questions. So rather than taking the floor and talking, you can punch your questions into here when the time comes, when the people are doing the presentations. And then you can also rate the questions, and they go up and down, and we can prioritize the questions as well like that. So also, just if you are writing in the question, please direct it to whoever it's at, and that helps the moderator to target the questions. And yeah, please avoid then, in that case, the MS Teams chat function. Otherwise, we'll get confused where the questions are going. Just use the MS Teams chat function if there's like a technical issue or something like that on your end. Then the slides and event guide are available I'd ask Brenda if you can put in the URL in the chat bar. The slides, we're having a bit of problem uploading them to the website, but they should be there soon. And then the big one is to keep yourself muted unless you're talking. So I don't hear any background noise, so I think that's already happening. And if we do start hearing the background noise, we'll mute you. And then just before taking the floor, raise your hand. That's the symbol, the guy giving the high five. And make sure to unmute yourself before you start talking. Then if your bandwidth is insufficient and you're having trouble receiving the sound and the visual at the same time, you can go to this 3 dots here, and that brings up another menu where you can turn off the incoming video. So that might help if you're having troubles. So with that, I can move to the first Mentimeter questions. And I'd ask Brenda again to punch in the code there, and now you can already put it into your other device, preferably your telephone, I think is the easiest. Otherwise, it's fine as well to use another screen on your computer. And we'll just go through some very light-hearted questions to begin. And with that, I would hand over to Brenda and Sana. Please, Brenda and Sana, go ahead.
Thank you, Suri, and welcome everybody to this webinar. And you can now go on to menti.com and enter the code that we just gave in the chat box for our first activity. So you should be able to now answer the first question, which is, what country are you participating from today? And we can see that at least 9 participants have answered now, and we have people from South Africa, Germany, Uganda, India, USA. More are coming, UK, Kenya. 19 participants, 20 have answered at the moment. So we seem to have quite a good reach geographically. 23. Okay, it seems like most of our participants are actually from Uganda and Germany. Some from Thailand as well. And moving on to our next question.
So our next question is, what kind of organization do you work for? Would like to know, would like to hear from you. Are you from the government, private sector, NGOs? We've got a couple of people from development partners, financial institutions. We've got a good mix of people. I think the majority are from the development partners and the private sector. Yeah, thank you for your participation. Yeah, we have 25 participants and half of us are from development partners and private sector. Thank you very much for that. We'll go to the next question.
And the next question is, what is your experience with standardized baselines? First option is, I have used it in the context of CDM. The second one, I have used it in a context other than the CDM. Third one, I am an SB developer. And fourth, I do not have much experience with SBs yet. It seems that we actually have a division between participants who don't have much experience in SBs and then who have used it in the context of CDM. a few SB developers as well. So this looks like we are going to have some interesting discussions also in the Q&A sessions. And 26 of you have now answered this question. So I think we have a good representation who are involved in this webinar today.
Thank you. And our next question is, what word comes to mind when you think about SBs? Would like to know, especially those who have not had any experience, what word comes to mind when you think about SBs? Technical, CDM, lengthy processes, monitoring, lots of data, simplification. Interesting. Yes, complex calculations. Yeah, majority think of CDM. Well, thank you for all those answers. Solar lights. Wow, lots of things come to mind when we think about SBs. Thank you for your answers. We'll go to the next question.
So the next one is actually, we are going to have a question and answer session after the first two presentations from RCC Kampala and UNFCCC Bonn. And while the presenters are giving their presentations, you have the opportunity to already submit your questions through the Mentimeter, which then will be used for the Q&A session. And next, I will actually give the floor to my colleague, Ritah Rukundo, the technical officer at UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center, Kampala. She's been working as a technical officer for 5 years at the RCC and responsible for providing technical and procedural support for CDM projects and program of activities, and also facilitating regional engagement to promote action towards achievement of the objectives and goals of the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement. And she will be now telling you about the story so far of the standardized baselines. You're welcome, Ritah.
Great. Thank you, Sana. I'm not sure if my presentation is viewing in full screen and if everyone can hear me well. Perfect. Thanks, Suri. I'll just put it in full screen now. Thank you, Suri and Sana, Brenda, for the introduction. And hi to everyone. Good afternoon from Kampala and good morning to other colleagues and the rest of the world. As mentioned, I'll just give an introduction or an overview on standardized baselines and a bit of the progress to date and how things are looking within the region. So basically, as an early step in project development, and for this case, we're referring to project development under the Clean Development Mechanism. It requires project participants to set baselines which help identify the level of emissions that would have occurred without the CDM project, or otherwise referred to as determination of additionality. So standardized baselines allow baseline to be calculated only once for a class of projects or for a sector, as opposed to being calculated separately for each of the CDM projects. And once this baseline is approved, it's applicable for a default duration of 3 years. And this is in accordance with the approved methodologies, those that have been Clean Development Mechanism methodologies and tools for the development of these baselines that have been approved by the CDM Executive Board. And still, these are also in line with existing procedures, guidelines, and standards still developed specifically for this framework. So in terms of the approaches, there's two approaches, one being the bottom-up and the other a top-down approach for the development of baselines. So under the bottom-up approach, a project participant or entity may propose this baseline through a national entity referred to as a designated national authority of this specific host party. And this would be in accordance with procedures for the development of standardized baselines. And it's also common practice that the DNA or designated national authority would use the support of a technical consultant for this work. So for the top-down approach, this happens in a case where the DNA, in this case, the DNA would need to submit a letter of expression of interest for the development of these baselines, and as per recent ruling, the DNA would need to provide some information to sort of justify why they need to have it developed as a top-down approach. So some of this information would include mentioning what the barriers are for the DNA to develop this baseline using the other approach, which would be the bottom-up process. They would provide information on the types of technologies and measures that would be applied for this specific sector, projections of emission reductions, and other information that's required for this case. So for this kind of approach, the top-down approach, the CDM Executive Board usually sits to discuss this kind of cases during its mid-year and end-of-year meetings. So what are the benefits of standardized baselines? So we look at the aspect of time saving. I hinted on this earlier. Also, SBs sort of address the issue of standardization at a higher level, and specifically having the advantage of application for a sectoral approach.
Sorry, Ritah. I think
yes.
We're stuck at the first slide. Are there more slides coming, or they're not loading on our side?
I've moved it. I'm not sure it's not moved to the next slide.
No, it hasn't moved to the next slide. Let me, maybe
Sorry.
if I project it.
Let me try to do it manually here. Has that moved?
Yeah, I've actually taken control, Ritah. Can you just tell me what slide you were on?
Sure, exactly that slide. I was on the third slide on the benefits of standardized baselines. Yes. So are you seeing? I don't know if you're seeing that now. Okay, great. Yeah, so I was mentioning that standardized baselines also have the advantage for applicability in terms of a sectoral approach, so regional or country specific, and they also have a benefit of being cost effective, and this is specifically important for underrepresented countries where resources are limited. Also looking at what's ongoing currently, countries updating or revising their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. We see baselines as an important component potentially being applied under a broader national MRV system for countries as they account and measure their emissions for their NDCs. And this also in a way links to the importance that baselines come with in terms of transparency and credibility, where they are fully vetted at different levels by the Secretariat, by the Executive Board, by a third-party assessor, also referred to as a designated operational entity, and also are often available for public comments. Next slide, please. Thanks, Suri. So who may propose a baseline? I hinted on this earlier. It could be parties or country entities or project participants. industry organizations, observer organizations, and these would submit the baseline through the DNA, who is the party I mentioned, the designated national authority. And for the case where a standardized baseline is for a group of parties, I'll mention this a little later. For a group of parties, each of the parties would need to approve it and submit an endorsement to the executive board, still through a designated national authority who would be representing all the parties under this baseline. Next slide. Yes, so in the context of Eastern and Southern Africa, currently there's been 19 standardized baselines that have been approved to date. And these have been in the sectors that you see here in West, in forestry, energy efficiency, rural energy and cooking, which includes institutional cooking and household cooking. Then in the electricity sector, and specifically for the grid computation of a value for the grid emissions factor. And this has been mainly for 17 parties who have actually been able to submit these baselines. And this includes one group of parties, so a group of 9 parties or countries that constitute the Southern African Power Pool, who have submitted a group, a regional standardized baseline for the grid emissions factor. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just this last slide to explain where we are at now in terms of the regulatory framework for standardized baseline. There have been some modifications and improvements to the framework, and at the meeting of the executive board, the 99th meeting, they provided an option for project participants to choose a validity period beyond beyond the default 3-year value, but of course this would be justified by the project developer or entity. And in addition to that, they've in the existing standardized baseline framework, there's the development of baselines using data, also including that could be available in documentation that has been submitted by CDM projects and program of activities. So this is also something that would help address the issue of data inadequacy in developing countries and least developed countries. It's also important to note that some of these baselines have expired to date, and there's a gap period that would happen up to the time when a new baseline is updated. So on a case-by-case basis, the executive board has been able to approve use of the value that had initially been approved for this time until the next update. And also importantly, further work is still ongoing. So the recently concluded executive board meeting provided for further work on provisions for development of these baselines to ease the process, and also to facilitate or to support DNAs in the update of expired baselines for future work. So that's it from my side. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after the next presentation. So back to you, Suri. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritah. So I noticed before when we were using the Mentimeter, we have about 40 or almost 50 participants, but I don't think everyone was participating in the Mentimeter, so I just thought I would explain again how it works. So you can type in the URL that we had before, the menti.com, and put that maybe in your telephone or in a separate browser, and then with the code that was shared, you can get in and you can ask questions. So until now, I haven't seen anyone question, but I think we can. Okay, so I'm seeing a first question coming in. I'm just wondering, is everyone seeing that coming in? Like you can, if you're following it on your telephone, you can see the question has come in. So I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and can follow that. yeah, if you have any problems with that, just write in the MS Teams chat on the side if you need any assistance how to get in there. Okay then, so I can pass it over to let me just stop presenting here. Sorry. And next we have the presentation from Gaj Hegde, and he leads the regulatory development team focusing on the energy sector. So this team is in the mitigation division of UNFCCC. So if you know, this was formerly SDM, if you are familiar with the UNFCCC structure. And in his role as team lead, Gaj has contributed to the development of numerous methodologies and SBs under the CDM. He's also contributing to the development of ISO 14097, which is a framework of principles and requirements for assessing and reporting investments and financing activities related to climate change. Finally, Gaj is also engaged in the work of the IFI's Technical Working Group on harmonization of GHG standards. So as you can see, Gaj is deeply involved in the development of standards, and he's now going to take us through a presentation on the wider application of standardized baselines. Gaj, please, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Suri. Maybe it's better you bring up the slides because as we have seen from the previous presentation, it may be better you project it.
Okay, sure. I'm going there now.
Thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, for the next few minutes, I will take you through some of the information on SBs, the current status and the application, and then application outside of CDM as well. And then we'll also discuss something on the potential for SBs with a case study on building energy efficiency. And also we'll briefly discuss the barriers which have been communicated and some of the improvements being made. And the presentation from Ritah sets a good stage for me to present these issues. Next slide, please. So far, around 69 standardized baselines have been submitted and 48 of them have been approved. And they expire in several of them in 3 years. So we have 16 standardized baselines, which is currently active, and 32 of them have expired. And they have covered many sectors like the power, the grid emission factor, and the cook stoves, the baseline fuel consumption and fraction of non-renewable biomass, which is one of the key areas for the region, charcoal production, wastewater, rice cultivation, rice mill power generation, forestation, and transport. Next slide, please. So as was already mentioned by Ritah, there are also some regional factors like the one for South African Power Pool, which comprises 9 countries, and also West African Power Pool with 9 countries. Next slide, please. So this shows a trend of how they have been submitted. They are a little bit late in the CDM process. Around 2012, the SB started with the decision from the CMP. And in the initial years, it was only the so-called the bottom-up SBs, which is the standardized baseline developed by the project developer and submitted by the DNAs. At some point, the board also allowed development of top-down SBs, which is a SB developed in collaboration among the bodies of the board, like the Secretariat and the MET panel and the DNAs. So over years, there is also some of the top-down developed SPs, and then interestingly, even in 2009, there have been many submissions for the SPs. Next slide, please. So this shows some of the usage of the SPs. The SAP grid emission factor has been quite extensively used in the projects and POAs, and then nearly 6 million CRs have been issued, and there are also other SPs for example, cook stoves, and then the other charcoal and all, which have been applied to the projects. This is not a extensive compilation of all the application, but this is some of the findings we did in a quick search. Next slide. In addition to the ones I listed, the initial application of the SPs was also for the so-called fraction of non-renewable biomass for the projects and POAs, which assist the clean cook stove projects. And there were a number of them approved in the initial years, and many of them, or most of them, have expired now, but that allowed to kickstart the projects in the clean cook stove sector, which made it easy to apply the fraction of non-renewable biomass or even the baseline fuel wood consumption. This has been highlighted by some of the leading officials from the region, policymakers, and in fact, the South African representative in one of the side events of the EB in the COP highlighted the usefulness of the SAP grid factor. And in some other cases, they have also served to show that the number you pick for your baseline is conservative. This is one example where a cook stove project in Burundi cited the SP from the region to show that the number they are choosing is conservative. Next slide. Recent years, beyond the CDM, the SPs are also being used in other applications like Green Climate Fund projects. We have noted a few of them which cite the CDM grid factors. One example is the ASP34 grid factor for WAP, which has been used by one of the GCF projects, and also similarly SAP has also been used, and then some of the cook stove related factors have also been used in the GCF funded projects. Similarly, NAMA was mentioned, and the application of SP has also covered the NAMAs. And also some of the projects funded by IFIs have made use of the SPs. So there's one example from IDB, which uses an approved SP for one of the projects they fund. Next slide. Now going to the potential of SP, although there has been some application of SP, the real potential from the application of SP really stays as a potential. I'm particularly looking at one sector on the building energy efficiency, how SP could play a role. Here, building and construction account for nearly 40% of the global emissions. This includes operational emissions, which is energy for heating and cooling and lighting, which is about 2/3 of that, and then 1/3 of that would be embodied emissions in the materials. And many bodies or many studies have recognized the potential for emission reduction in this area. For example, from World Green Building Council, it estimates that 40% less embodied emissions need to happen by 2030 and 100% net zero emissions by 2050. There have been many methodologies in CDM for building sector, like 50 methodologies and 2 tools and over 200 projects. But the amount of CERs issued is quite small in this area, and there are many reasons. Some are outside the scope of CDM, but one of the reasons often cited is high efforts are required to quantify for the low revenue from or low CERs from this sector. So in some ways, SPs can play a role to reduce the complexity there. Next slide. To illustrate the potential, I have also picked up one information from IEA. It shows the unit energy consumption for heating and cooling and other uses in the building space from 2010 to 2018. Many of them, like space heating or lighting, over a year, the efficiency has increased, which means per meter square consumption has dropped. But you can see that for space cooling, it is increasing still. So which shows that bigger air conditioners are being used, they are being used more. So there seems to be a big potential in this area as other areas. This could be one thing to further look into. Next slide, please. And also the energy code for buildings. In this illustration, it shows that the blue colored ones are where mandatory building codes have been already implemented, but the gray ones, which is or the yellow ones, which are still in the process of adopting this green building codes, which is the case for most of Africa. So there is a potential to develop this codes as well as at the same time use the data to develop SB. So you can achieve two purposes at the one goal. Next slide, please. I'm going to illustrate this potential with one concrete example for building energy efficiency from Korea, which is submitted as PSB 0054, and the consideration of which is ongoing. So in the case of Korea, there is significant emission from the domestic sector, nearly 17% in terms of energy consumption, but about 28% in terms of emissions. So this comes from both residential and commercial building sector. And as many of you know, there is ambitious emission reduction target included in the Korea NDC. Next slide, please. So here, while developing this standardized baseline, the authorities got together and they looked at the potential. And there are, fortunately, in Korea, there is a very good data collection system, probably one of the best in the world. So it covers 7 million data for building characteristics and about 4.4 billion data on the energy consumption of each of these buildings, which includes electricity and gas consumption and district heat. So there's a listing of a number of parameters here, and then a number of data suppliers are involved, and very good metering system to collect all this data. Next slide, please. So having looked at data, the ones who were developing this SB, they considered various options and then decided to focus on residential buildings and apartment and the apartments that do not receive district heating at the moment as the target for this SB. Next slide. So although initially it looks quite complex, they considered a lot of parameters which would influence the use of energy or which cause emissions, which includes a lot of factors which you see in the left, which can be the heating system, the climatic region, the space of the built area and size of the household, and this number of stories, the height, and so many factors they looked at. And then they applied some filters on to really look at what is that which is causing emissions. And then in the end, they have just come to 3 climatic regions, and then within that 2 parameters, one for the old building and one for the new building. So they have developed factors for square meter area for 3 representative climatic regions in the whole country, and then they get numbers for 2 for the new and existing buildings separately. So although it seems complex with many parameters involved, but when you look at closely, it can be condensed to few parameters which really influence the emissions in the built area. Next slide, please. So one of the things they found out after making all the calculation was that the rules of the SP to apply the top 20% will result in quite a stringent baseline. So here you see that the baseline for the SP is from on the left, you see the level of the national level of the rating for the building. So this includes 1+, 1++, and 1 triple+ type of buildings, which are usually quite efficient. And then the mandatory requirement within Korea is to go towards 1 and 2. So the threshold set by SB is even higher than the mandatory thresholds, which may be, you can see it in two ways, which can be seen as sort of barrier in terms of it leaves out some of the buildings, but it can also be a blessing in disguise, in the sense if you want to show compliance with the Paris Agreement goals, maybe you already need to look at such rigorous baselines. Next slide. So similar examples, we have also compiled one case with help from GIZ. We collected the data on refrigerator from Ghana with the Energy Commission of Ghana providing this data through GIZ. And then we had 2,440 models of refrigerators for the study, and then it showed that you could very well develop this standardized baseline, but it will be quite rigorous in the sense it is 90th percentile of these values was when it was done was comparing to some of the very high efficiency classes of EU. Next slide. Yeah, to sum up, there are some barriers which have been communicated. Whereas also there are some SBs have significantly contributed to project development. One example is the SAP and WAP, there are also a few other for the cook stoves which have been used pretty well, but there are some others which have been not used. And looking at some of the barriers communicated by the stakeholders, these include some of the requirement to have mandatory DOE assessment for each of the renewal, and also limited 3-year validity of the SPs, and some of the issues related to stringency of the threshold, which I mentioned now. Some of these issues have been already resolved by the board through changes to the rules, like the length of the SB can be longer than 3 years now, and the other issues are under consideration by the board, and the board has mandated the secretariat and its body to further work on this issue. But also some of these issues, although they seem to have been a barrier compared to the trend of the past or the methodologies of the past, but they may also turn out to be quite useful for the future when you look at the kind of emission reductions required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it could also serve to very well do that kind of reduction required. Next slide. Yeah, with that, I'm quite hopeful that its potential remains great, and then it is going forward. We can use more and more of these options to drive home more emission reductions in some of the sectors which have not so far been well covered by CDM. Thank you, and back to you, Suri.
Thanks a lot, Gaj. Great. So I've seen a number of questions have been coming in through the Mentimeter, and I'll actually hand over now to Brenda and to Sana to take you through those questions, and also Ritah and Gaj, you might like to also get onto the Mentimeter and have a look at the questions that have been coming through. But yeah, Brenda and Sana are going to steer you through those, and then John from GIZ is going to take over the moderating role. And I'll see you again at the end. So thank you. Brenda and Sana, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Suri, and we are switching back to the Mentimeter. So if you haven't yet, please, and have a question that you would like to submit, please go to menti.com and use the code that you can see now on the screen. And also, please, if you're not speaking, could you please mute your microphone? Thank you. And you can also see, while you're submitting your question, you can see the other questions submitted and choose to vote for one of them, as we will be taking the questions in the order of popularity. So the first one actually will be, what is the potential for the use of SBs in Article 6? And do you think we could copy and paste the methodologies? And I think maybe this first question will be directed to Gash.
Yeah, the Article 6 rules are being negotiated. It's difficult to say exactly what role SB will say for sure, but some of the drafts which were under consideration touched upon SBs, irrespective of the final rules from the Article 6. We believe the method of the SBs, which is quite rigorous and which is quite takes into account a lot of issues related to data quality and all, will be applicable in future for any mitigation activity.
Thank you very much, Gash. And I see we have a few questions now. Thank you for everybody who have been submitting them. And the next one is regarding SB. Can the same be made also region-specific rather than a country-specific? Maybe Gash, you will take this one as well.
Yeah, that is one of the advantages of the SB. There is the rules are not so tight to restrict to country level or a specific region within the country. It can also be developed for multiple countries, as we have seen in the case of SAP and WAP. The only issue will be that then you have to bring together many of the DNAs to come to a decision from there and to communicate to the board. But it's quite flexible, and it is by design allows this kind of aggregation at various levels within the country, region in the country, or multiple countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Gash. That, I think, was quite clear. So indeed, it can also be region specific. And our next one will be, what new guidelines? Oh no, let me go back a bit. What new guidelines has the Executive Board developed to support developing countries in the update of existing baselines? Please provide some more information on this.
I think, Sana, I'll respond to that, if that's okay.
Sure, please go ahead, Ritah.
So yes, I mentioned this point in my presentation, and as mainly referring to work that's ongoing at the moment. So at the previously concluded meeting of the Executive Board, they considered a concept note around revision of the regulatory provisions of standardized baselines, and one of the aspects was to sort of look around ways to support DNAs in update of expired baselines. So this work is still ongoing, and there'll be a revised concept note submitted for discussion at the next EB meeting. So it would be good to, to keep track of the discussion. Thanks. Thank you.
The next question is, how long is the process of developing? The next question is, how long is the process of developing a standardized baseline? I think that would go to Gaj.
Yeah, it depends on the quality of the data which is there, and then the preparation which went into the SB developing numbers. If they are robust, if they are done well, then it can happen fairly quickly. Like the board has developed some flexible procedures. There is no need to take to a MET panel meeting. For example, one can directly send to the board secretariat, and some assigned members of the MET panel can review it in quick time and then send to the board for approval. So yeah, I mean, if everything goes well, it can be as quick as 3 months, but there are cases where it took much longer because of some of the issues were not clear, or the data quality was not that good, or many reasons like that. In that case, it can be over a year also. So it really depends on the quality of the data which is available and understanding of the requirement. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that answer, Gash. And the next one is I see 0 CERs for charcoal in Uganda. Could it be that the SB is indeed useful, but benefiting gold standard projects? Ritah, would you like to answer this one?
Yes, thanks, Sana. Yeah, that's a good observation. Of course, it's some of the baselines that have been submitted have not necessarily been applied yet to some of the projects, but also takes me back to the question that I saw someone ask about appropriateness of the sectors that these baselines are developed. So this is entirely up to the country that's developing this baseline using the bottom-up approach based on what the country priorities are and where the DNA sees the need to have a baseline developed, also in consultation with other stakeholders. So for the case of charcoal, there's no project currently in Uganda. However, the recent update of the charcoal baseline for Uganda also incorporated a value for the fraction of non-renewable biomass, which has been really important or useful for projects that are applying this fraction for non-renewable biomass. So it's been an additional benefit for this kind of baseline that's been developed. Unfortunately, I cannot really speak on gold standard projects at the moment, but I'll also ask my colleague Gaj in case he has any addition to this question. Thank you.
Yeah, just to complement, I think we should not read too much into the statistics. For one reason, we did a quick search. It was not a thorough assessment of all projects where SPs have been applied. And also, as I showed, in some cases, even though SBs may not have been directly applied, but they have set a rigorous threshold, which is important from the environmental integrity perspective. So which the projects and POAs have looked at those thresholds, and then they have stayed below that. So they have indeed served the purpose in some cases. And then if they have been used in other emission reduction projects, it's also good as long as they have been contributing to the mitigation and to the climate change benefits. Doesn't matter where they are contributing. So back to you, Ritah.
Thank you very much, both Ritah and Gash. And we still have time for one more question, which is there an existing standardized baseline which can be used to develop a cookstove project? Gash, would you want to answer this one?
Yes, I think there must have been at least 8-10 standardized baseline for several countries in Africa, for which serve as the baseline for fuel wood consumption, and in some cases there is also the fraction of non-renewable biomass, both of which are indispensable to develop a cookstove project. So one could look at the database. So they could very well be used for someone developing the project in that area. Definitely, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And also thank you for all the participants who have submitted questions, and our colleagues Gaj from Bonn and Ritah from here, Uganda, for your answers. And next, I would like to introduce our moderator for the panel discussion, John Kasita Semulema, technical advisor from the GIZ Global Carbon Markets Program.
Sorry for that loss in time. We had a bit of a glitch here, but thanks very much, Sana, for that introduction. And thank you, Gaj and Ritah, for the very good overview that you've just given us in those two presentations. And the discussion was really, really interesting. So we want to take a deeper dive into the subject of standardized baselines. And to help us do that is 4 distinguished panelists that have, in one way or another, interacted with standardized baselines, be it from the process of development or, as a consultant or as a development partner, but also in the use, so the actual usage of the standardized baseline. And just to introduce our panelists today, we'll be joined by Ms. Gloria Namazi, who is a technical advisor with the GIZ Global Carbon Markets Program, based in Uganda and reaching out to the rest of the East African countries. Gloria oversees the development of carbon market instruments, including standardized baselines, and she also takes lead on private sector engagement into carbon markets in East Africa for that project. She's previously worked with the Uganda Carbon Bureau, where she has done a lot of work there, including participating in the development of the very first multi-country project of activities, the ICSEA project. We'll be joined also by Harikumar Gadde from the World Bank. Hari is a climate change specialist with like 15 years of work experience in carbon markets and carbon pricing. He's one of the leading members of the Article 6 work program for piloting next generation of carbon market concepts. And Hari coordinates the technical work on the partnership for market readiness. And he also leads on the standardized crediting framework implementation. To join us also will be Ms. Gloria Namande, who brings to this conversation 10 years of experience working in the renewable energy and climate change mitigation sectors. She's focusing on supporting countries in she's worked supporting countries in East Africa in the past, but she's currently the project manager for the NDC support program at the UNDP Uganda office. And Gloria specifically supports the development of Uganda's NDC monitoring and reporting verification system, in which she works together with the climate change department here in Uganda. Last and not least, we'll also be joined by Professor Francis Yamba. I haven't seen him on the chat box here. Professor, are you there? So I'm not really sure if Professor is joining us. Well, not to lose time, we'll have to start off with our first panelist. Professor could join us when he finally makes his way into the call. And I want to start with you, Gloria Namazi. So you work with the Global Carbon Markets Program, which has, in the last few years, supported development of up to 4 to 5 standardized baselines in the region. What has your experience been like extending support to the standardized baselines? But also, most importantly, where do you see the future of standardized baselines as we speak about the transition?
Okay, thank you so much, John, for that introduction. First of all, I want to say I'm really happy to be part of this panel, and I'm really glad to see so many familiar people attend this webinar. And as John mentioned, over the years, the Global Carbon Markets Program has supported countries in East Africa to come up with to develop and process standardized baselines. And these countries have included Rwanda, where we developed a charcoal baseline. And also in Kenya, we are currently doing the grid emission factor, which has just been submitted to the UNFCCC for approval. But also in Uganda, we've done several, including the cook stove SB, the charcoal SB, as well as now we are doing the grid emission factor. And as a program, we feel this is really important because it improves access to the carbon market for programs, both the private sector, but also government sector players. And part of the experience there has been that this is a really country-driven process where the designated national authorities are in the driver's seat, and in the sense that they identify the sectors where they want baselines developed, but also are part of the whole process. They exchange with the different stakeholders and also engage see that
we don't hear you.
Sorry, John, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, my network is acting up, but in terms of the country driving this process, I think over a year ago we started the East African Alliance on Carbon Markets, and this alliance brings together countries within the East Africa region. And so through that alliance, we hope to still engage countries that are members to this alliance to further help them develop standardized baselines. And the key there is that countries have to demand for the standardized baselines to ensure that I think from the last presentation, one participant raised the issue of the baselines being used and applied. So to ensure that the baselines are used, we want the countries to really demand for the baselines and also look into the sectors where such baselines will be applied. Yeah, and another key area, key lesson that we've learned from our experience is that data is a very critical issue when it comes to developing standardized baselines. And this could be both primary or secondary data from, say, documents developed by international bodies, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization, but also primary data that is in existence within the different ministries or institutions. And as the designated national authorities, they are tasked to coordinate and ensure that all this data is made available. Certainly there are challenges there in the sense that there's no central place for most of these countries where data can be obtained from. But what we see is that stakeholder engagement is very key here in the sense that the key stakeholders from the different sectors are identified to be the source of data. And this is should be data that is credible, data that is accurate, but also data that is valid. For example, there's a requirement that at least this data should be up to date, recent, perhaps 3 years. And for most of these countries, we see that recent and updated data is not easily available. And so in the support that we give, we help countries with consultants who dig deep for the data, but also offer the technical backstopping for this process. And part of that requires the DNAs to ensure quality assurance and quality control. And here they have to ensure that whatever data has been used is credible and valid, and the processes that are being used to generate this data are very transparent and conform to the guidelines as provided by the UNFCCC. And what has also helped also is to engage the RCC very early on in the process, and this will ensure that you avoid a back and forth. I think Gaj brought this up in terms of the length of the process. You find that if the data used has many questions, it will delay the approval process. So to avoid any such delays, it's quite important to bring on board the RCC right at the onset so that they can provide that guidance, but also that technical backstopping in terms of the methodologies, but also the tools used to calculate the standardized baselines. And as I conclude, what we think for the future, because our program is carbon market centered and also looking at NDC implementation, we hope that the standardized baselines can help with the new framework on carbon markets under Article 6, but also be tools used within the NDC enhancement process. Previously, part of the support I think we did for Uganda was develop the institutional cooking standardized baseline, and we saw that this was used beyond CDM. We had a NAMA that used this baseline in calculating their emission reductions. So we want to see standardized baselines evolve to go beyond just mitigation action within the CDM portfolio, but look into other ways that the baselines can be used, say for Article 6, but also for NDC enhancement. And here, the monitoring, reporting, and verification aspects within the countries have to be really developed, and so that they can be able to provide the required data and also facilitate this process of standardized baseline development. Yeah, with those few remarks, I will hand back to you, John, for your session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gloria, for that very good insight that you just gave us. I also just learned that Professor Yamba is successfully now joining, so we are lucky that we'll have him at a later point in time. But I also just want to remind the audience, that you can use the Mentimeter that was earlier shared by my colleagues to submit your questions. So as the panelists go on with their discussion and their input, kindly feel free to come through with your questions that are directed to either them or whichever other panelists that will have spoken. Gloria, you touched a couple of things, which also included the use of Article 6, the use of standardized baselines in Article 6 implementation, and we also joined on the panel by Gloria Namande, who is the project manager for the NDC support program here in Uganda. Gloria, you are working with the Climate Promise, and you are hoping to use SBs as a tool for enhancing NDC implementation. How do you hope to do that?
Thank you so much, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm also happy to be part of this discussion with familiar colleagues, and happy to meet you all via this platform. Thank you, John, for the question. First of all, I just want to give a short glimpse of what the UNDP Climate Promise is. Then I'll talk about how the SBs are relevant in the NDC enhancement, and I'll also give a few examples on how we are integrating SBs in the NDC enhancement process in some of the countries that UNDP is supporting. Yeah, so just to give you a brief introduction about the Climate Promise, UNDP launched what they call the Climate Promise at the UN Climate Summit in September 2019. And the Climate Promise is basically is aimed to support countries enhance their NDCs under the Paris Agreement. And I think most of us are familiar that right now countries are currently revising their NDCs in light of the requirements under the Paris Agreement. And under the Climate Promise, we have 5 service lines. The first service line is building political will and societal ownership at both national and subnational levels to deliver on the NDC commitments. We are looking at reviewing, aligning, and updating the existing targets within the NDCs, but also reviewing the policies and measures that countries put forward in their current NDCs to see if this can be aligned to the existing environment and the existing conditions that countries are having right now, since the former NDCs were developed. We are looking at incorporating new sectors and greenhouse gas emissions, because since 2015, when countries develop their NDCs, their current developments, for instance, in the energy sector, in the transport sector, there are new technology developments that countries are currently developed. So we are looking at incorporating these different elements. And then the fourth is assessing cost and investment opportunities around the NDCs, and also monitoring progress and transparency. So in light of these service lines for revising the NDCs, how are the SBs relevant? How are the standards baselines relevant? And how can they be applicable in the NDC enhancement process? First of all, we know that accounting for the NDC mitigation targets as a requirement under the Article 4.13 of the Paris Agreement. Note that, first of all, countries have to understand their own mitigation targets, but as well be able to collectively assess the progress towards the achievement of these mitigation targets. And as a result of that, countries need to clearly communicate their baseline scenarios regarding these mitigation targets. They have to show and construct these baseline scenarios in a manner that promotes environmental integrity, in a manner that promotes transparency, accuracy, completeness, compatibility, consistency, and also in a bit to avoid double counting. There has to be this kind of transparency. We've seen that, as I mentioned, one of the key service lines under the climate promise is incorporating new sectors and greenhouse gas emissions in these revised NDCs. SBs in this case can provide information for baseline setting, because here we are looking at the start date, for instance, of a project or a new technology when it was implemented. We are looking at policies to be included in the baseline. We are looking at parameters affecting the emission estimates for different sectors. We are looking at the drivers of emissions. We've seen so many countries are now, subsidizing new technologies, renewable energy technologies. There are a number of incentives coming up, and some of the countries have also thrown away, or they are not dealing with fossil fuels anymore. So we are looking at what are the drivers for the emissions and what are the new areas for emission reductions. We are looking at the methodologies used, the assumptions and uncertainties. So you find that this information is important when it comes to the review of these new sectors and the greenhouse gas emissions for the revised NDCs. And this is information that we can get from the different baselines. I'd also like to mention that right now, as countries are reporting through their national communications and biannual update reports, the issue of looking beyond CDM actually is very significant. When we come to the biannual update reports and the national communications, we see that countries need to come up with emission projections and baseline scenarios for the national communications and the BURs. So this requires reporting, for instance, on the policies and measures that have been implemented over a certain period of time. The standardized baselines in this case will help us to define these baseline scenarios in terms of these policies and measures, in terms of the emission scenarios that countries have developed, so that they can be able to effectively develop and report on their mitigation targets under the national communications and the biannual update reports. So what have we done in regards to the use of these SBs when it comes to the countries we are supporting under the NDC enhancement? I'm
going to ask you to wrap up a bit because we have some other two panelists to join us. So I'll ask you to wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay, thank you, John. So I want to just give two examples for Ghana and Uganda. We are currently developing the emission factors for the waste sector for Uganda. And Uganda right now, through the Ministry of Energy, is coming up with an standardized baseline for the waste sector. So this will be a very important baseline that will help us in defining these emission factors that will be important for the update of the NDC waste sector. And in Kenya, we are also looking at using existing recycling methodologies for the waste sector. And under this, we are also looking at the details on how that these methodologies would help in increasing the carbon revenues for the waste sector and engaging the private sector. So in a nutshell, I would like to conclude by saying that we are looking beyond the CDM to ensure that the SBs are helping countries to revise their NDCs, to help in accounting for their NDCs, but are opening up new opportunities for investment and finance. For instance, under Article 6, it has already been mentioned that countries, through these accounting procedures, countries will be able to define which mitigation outcomes can be transferred or can be utilized to meet their conditional targets of the NDCs. So I feel that the SBs right now, we need to first of all, one important thing I would like us to think about is how do we engage the government to define and analyze capacity gaps for them to create the linkages between the existing MRV work that is going on, the national communications, the biannual update reports, and the standardized baselines. I think this is where the gap is right now, and this is what we need to address while working with the government going forward, so that we can, be able to enhance the processes and support the utilization of the standardized baseline in the Paris Agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gloria, for that very comprehensive input. What I pick is that you definitely see a position for standardized baselines in the implementation of NDCs, and that it's very, very crucial that we see the SBs not in isolation, but as tools that we can couple with our MRV systems that need to be in place as we implement the NDCs. I think that's a very important message to have. It also means that we do not have to start from zero. In cases where there are existent SBs, this should be building blocks for putting together the necessary MRV system to help with implementation of NDCs. Thank you very much for that. I want to bring in, and I still want to remind the audience that you could use Mentimeter. The code has been shared with you there in the chat box. Please use Mentimeter to come through with your questions. We definitely want to engage our panelists with so many questions and have a very good discussion ensuing after this, after their input here. I want to now invite Hari from the World Bank. Hari, again, to build on what Gloria just told us, seeing a future of SBs in NDC implementation, but I want you to just give us a sort of different perspective. You mostly see the use of SBs in the new mechanism. I mean, we're not even sure if the new mechanism is going to exist, but of course the PMR is working on something like this, also would support something like this. So from that other angle, other than the NDCs, how do we still see that the SB is going to be a useful tool in the new mechanism?
Yeah, thanks, John. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. And also, I also want to thank RCC Uganda for inviting me for this panel discussion. As previous speakers already mentioned, of course, obviously standardization is not new. It's like a lot has been done under the CDM with, of course, the mixed success in terms of its application. I think somebody asked the question about the appropriateness. I think that is very, very crucial in our view, also based on our experience so far. It's very clear that we do not need to reinvent the wheel, and also hopefully that we also do not repeat the mistakes that we did with some, for example, with the development of such approaches. From our side, the key focus for us right now is how we see the role of such approaches, standardized baselines in terms of NDC implementation. In fact, the work that we are doing goes beyond the baselines. We're not only just discussing or exploring that how standardization can be applied not just for the baselines, but also to the process that countries follow internally, and also extend it further to MRV. Because during the CDM world, because we focused heavily on baselines, but a bit less, I would say that when, of course, in MRV, especially on the V side, though of course we try to bring some default factors in order to minimize some of the data that is required for certain parameters. But I think in the African context, at least our experience is that there is a huge potential that we should explore further to see how the transaction costs should be minimized. And it's also very clear for us, the work that we are doing right now, as a part of an effort to see how the existing POS can be transitioned to Article 6 environment, and also given the NDC context. So from there, the so-called standardized crediting framework that we are right now implementing in both Senegal and Rwanda, which we successfully did that one, and now we are planning to roll out that to another 9 countries in Africa, covering both West Africa, of course, and also East Africa. We have also been working with West African Powerful, for example, right now. Especially how individual NDCs of these countries And then their plans, for example, especially in the power sector, should be incorporated and considered while we developing some kind of a standardized baseline. And because this is a great potential for us to innovate. That's what actually we think that one, because all NDCs are forward-looking, and then every country has their ambitious plans. Of course, now the Rwanda is a very classic example. Like the recently submitted their NDC is, I think, one of the very well-developed NDCs in our view, also in the African country. So here, actually, we are using this as an opportunity to learn how future plans of governments and then future NDC targets can be considered as part of SB development process, and then use them also as an appropriate indicators to track the progress, because we are aiming to explore further how these standardized baselines can support with ensuring environmental integrity without relying on complicated ways of the methods that we used during CDM days. Of course, I mean, it's also very clear that even the discussions among the parties right now in the negotiations, when it comes to the transition of CDM methodologies to post-2020 environment, how standardized baselines may be used to determine the mitigation interventions that exceed NDC-related mitigation in the host country. On top of that, one another initiative that we are helping or working with some governments in Africa is also to see how actually we can help them to build MRV systems that facilitates the data collection in a consistent manner, because that's also one of the reasons why the transaction costs are very huge. I mean, for example, in the standardized crediting framework, in spite of so much standardization we did with respect to the baselines, with respect to the process that should be put in place at host country level, but when it comes to the MRV part of that one, it still took a lot of time because of the capacity issues, because of the data quality issues, and then the quality assurance of that one. So from that point of view, we are helping actually to develop the MRV systems also to standardize that thing. So just to wrap up, actually, John, because of the time constraints. So I mean, if you want to apply the lessons learned from CDM and to support countries with reducing the transaction costs, and the most importantly, they achieve the scale, because that is what is missing right now. In spite of having so many standardized baselines, you see that their application is very restricted. For variety of reasons, not necessarily because of the complexities or because of the appropriateness of the baseline. It goes much beyond that one. So where actually I agree with previous speakers also that we need to increase the domestic capacities and then help them to assess how the NDCs are set, and then see where it is possible to integrate those into the methodologies, because that's one of the things that at least right now the discussions are happening. So the standardized baselines, I think that's where this plays a very important role. But we need more pilots, more examples, and there are more innovative ways of doing this. And we strongly believe that Africa is a fertile ground to achieve this one. From our side, we continue to engage on multiple fronts and then help countries achieve their ambitious NDC targets, and SBs are one of the tools that we definitely going to rely on that one. So I'll stop it here. Maybe I'll happy to explain and clarify further if there are any questions. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you. And I think the message is clear there. It's not just enough to develop standardized baselines. It should be that wherever the standardized baseline is being developed, the absorption should take place because the people understand how to use it. That's a very strong message because, again, if you look at the list of SPs that we have and how many sectors they sort of reached out to and how many CDM projects emerged out of that, it even beats the argument for which the SPs were, first of all, put in place, because it was argued that they would reduce transaction costs and that they would spur development of projects. But if that didn't happen, it speaks to absorption of the tool that was developed in the first place. And we need to do a bit of capacity building on that front. But so thanks very much, Harry. I now want to bring in Professor Yamba, who just joined us. Thank you, Professor.
I confused the time. I thought we are 1 hour ahead of Uganda, but we were actually 1 hour behind. Sorry.
No worries, Professor. Let me just give you your well-deserved introduction because you deserve it. I did for the other panel. So Professor Yamba will join us and bring on board 44 years of work experience in teaching, research, and consultancy, management, and engineering applications. Professor was the former Dean of the School of Engineering at the University of Zambia. He is also formerly the Executive Director of the Technical Industrial Development Corporation. He's been the Managing Director of Engineering Services. Like the list of boards and executive positions that Professor has held is just so long. I beg for your permission not to read all of it. But I think most importantly for this discussion, Professor has 20 years. For the last 20 years, he has been actively involved in inventory and mitigation analysis for CDM projects. And he has contributed to the development of standardized baselines. So one for the charcoal SB in Zambia, I think, and then also for the grid emission factor for the South African power pool. But most importantly, Professor is a distinguished Nobel laureate because he, together with 700 other scientists in 2007, were joint winners of the Nobel Peace Prize with the former Vice President of the USA, Albert Gore. So in 2007, if you all remember that Nobel Peace Prize, it went to the IPCC and Al Gore at that point in time. And Professor Yamba was part of the 700 scientists that were part of the IPC at that point in time. So let's start there, Professor. How does it even feel? I mean, you have 44 years, you're a very distinguished achiever by all scales, but how does it feel to have something that reads like a Nobel Prize next to your CV?
Well, maybe I've been forgotten about it. It's great, but I've forgotten about it. It was 2007.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's because you have so many achievements, I guess.
Yes. Yes, can we go into the business, please?
Yes, of course. Let's move into the business, and we are going to now speak about your experience in using the standardized baseline when you actually used it for the development of a GCF project in Zambia. Just tell us about your experience on that.
Yes, when the CDM started, some colleagues, especially from UK, Mike Bess, said, no, we cannot have a regional baseline. I insisted that you can have a regional baseline. So about 10 years ago, we with GFA from Germany, we embarked on developing a regional baseline emission factor for power sector for sub countries. The countries are Congo, DR, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini. So we developed this baseline. Why we developed the baseline is to assist power utilities in the SADC region in accounting for their carbon footprint, as well as accessing carbon funds for their investment in new processes. Because countries like Zambia, Mozambique, and the Congo DR are hydro-based, so they need to have any big carbon footprint. So when we introduced this grid emission factor, they started benefiting from it. And then other benefits are that if there is no grid emission factor, Mozambique and Zambia cannot have the CDM projects. So, and also the other benefits for the regional factor is it reduces time to market and transaction costs, which we're talking about for new CDM projects and preparations. It also increases attractiveness of CDM investment in SADC beyond South Africa, because South Africa is the biggest region here and it's core-based, so we benefit from it. Some of us countries which are hydro-based, but one big advantage Zambia is going to benefit is the project we are developing now between Uganda, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. But Zambia and the Congo DR are in the sub-region. We're developing an RCC model, these capacitor banks. model, because most of the power utilities lose electricity through low power factor utilization. So we've developed a project in 4 countries, Zambia included, which will reduce a lot of electricity. I think we are talking of about 500 gigawatt hour Zambia will save from this project. It's a 45 million project, which will start very, very soon. And then Zambia will be able to avoid over 200 tons of carbon dioxide per year. I'd like to stop here for the time being.
Okay, thanks a lot, Prof, for these insights. I just now want to run to our Mentimeter, and I want to share the screen with you now, where a couple of questions have been coming through. Are you able to see the screen? Maybe
yes,
not.
Yes.
But so we've had a couple of questions coming through the audience, and I would like the panelists to start treating some of them already. There's questions to both Gloria's, UNDP and GIZ. Do you envision any future support for SB's development post 2020? Any one of you, Gloria's, could take that. Or both of you.
Okay, can I go, John?
Please.
Yes, thank you, John. I think in my view, I see the future support for SB's post 2020 exists because in the NDC implementation processes, we have currently, for instance, I'll give an example for Uganda. There are about 5 sectors for the NDC. We have energy, transport, agriculture, forestry, waste sector. You find that all these sectors, the country is now looking at how to implement specific projects for these sectors. And why we need these SBs would be in line. For instance, we need to develop the baseline scenarios for the emission reductions for the waste sectors, but also knowing that most of our NDC, especially for Uganda, are highly conditional, 70% conditional. We are looking at opportunities under Article 6, carbon finance opportunities under Article 6 to support the implementation of our NDCs. And I would like to give an example that right now UNDP is currently exploring opportunities to support the implementation of projects in the energy sector. And we are really looking at the Green Schools NAMA as one of the key projects that could be supported under Article 6. And we know that we have the SB already on improved cookstoves, and actually we are looking at updating this SB under the NDC enhancement process. So we cannot develop these projects without SBs. We definitely need to have the SBs as a platform to provide information on these emission reductions, the baseline scenarios, but also to leverage on opportunities for carbon finance. So I see this all continuing post 2020. Thank you.
Yeah, also from our side as GIZ, I think this is a support that we'll continue to offer to countries and governments. As I mentioned before, this would come through the alliance that we've formed now on carbon markets and climate finance. And as I mentioned also, the main objective is to improve access to the market. And now with Article 6 as the new markets framework, we hope to continue helping countries come up with the SBs with the intention and purpose that countries engage within the Article 6 framework, even it may be through pilots, but also as the rules become clearer, actual projects. So yeah, in a nutshell, yes, we are happy to support countries to develop more of these SBs. Yeah, thank you. John, back to you.
Thanks, Gloria. And Gloria, I think the message is clear. These are still needed tools, and there will be support for that. I would like to pass on to either Harry or Professor. There's a question here. How come there are some SBs that were not used? Were these top-down developments? I mean, why is it that some SBs were never used at all? I mean, other than the fact that you spoke about capacity to utilize, but were these because of top-down developments? Harry?
Yeah, John, I think so. Yeah, it's also a difficult question to answer, because I think one angle to that to say, like, whether it's a top down or bottom up, I think so when it is developed, so it is developed with a certain objective, like, I think that is also one of the things that we notice, that I think there's also one similar question, like, whether it makes actually financially sense to develop SPs also. I think the answer relates to both of these questions, like, because countries, when it comes to the bottom-up process, so host country DNAs, I mean, it's like, so given their lack of capacity and also, of course, understanding the technicalities of the different things, so because we have seen, for example, in bottom-up cases, of course, a project developer with developing a POA with an assumption that there will be a number of CPS that are going to be implemented and then use such kind of SP. So with a very, very optimistic projection, so they see a value in developing such kind of a standardized baseline. But in reality, I mean, it's like, we all know that if you assess a number of POAs that are implemented, especially in African region, and then how many CPAs are included in each of the POA, that gives a picture, like, like it's not necessarily an issue of standardized baseline itself. It goes much beyond that one, like, the project economics and then the feasibility and etc. etc. So it's not because of I don't think it's just because of the top-down nature where UNFCCC Secretariat has developed without looking into the potential for use of such kind of an SBS is one of the reasons, but it is basically, boils down to, in my view, the initial assessment that the country and also the developers need to make. I think that is the one effort that at least we are trying to see right now whenever we wanted to engage with the government on such kind of things. So assess what is the real potential for that one. Now, of course, NDCs give us some context and then some information that we might use actually to look into that one. Okay, in that particular sector, like, what are the targets that government is setting, and then what is the mitigation potential, and then what is the cost of abatement, and then the opportunity cost for the country to meet those targets. So from that point of view, and then assess, like, what are the costs involved for us to develop the standardized baseline. I mean, obviously the data is the key issue. That's where basically most of the costs will go. And of course, and also the frequency at which the standardized baseline needs to be updated. So assessing that transaction costs upfront, of course, it need not be to zero to the last digit accuracy, but that gives a fair picture actually, like, whether it makes sense for us to develop the standardized baseline or not. I mean, it's like most of the standardized baselines, like, redemption factor is a standardized baseline. It is there for more than a decade, and then now we are, of course, giving the new name to standardized baseline to that one, and then trying to see that how we can help countries to develop this thing and regularly update that. So there are several factors that we need to look into this one, and we cannot just simply say it's because of the top down, so there is no utilization of the standard baseline. So maybe Professor can add something to what I just said.
For us in the SADC region, the project I talked about, the Capacity Bank project, is being implemented under Article 6. So we are already using the standard baseline for that purpose. It will save a lot of carbon credits in the region. We're talking of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. Of course, Uganda is not in the region. We are yet not connected. So we are ready, and also in some other projects which have been developed in the region, they've used the baseline emission factor. But first of all, it was for 5 years. 5 years, the baseline finished in 5 years' time. And then it was renewed last year for another 5 years. So the people now are aware of the baseline of the grid emission factor, and I think we'll be able to develop more projects through that. But this project I'm talking about will just start sometime in this year in Zambia. So we are going to learn a lot from the standard baseline, and then transfer the knowledge to other countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of questions are coming through, and thank you very much for the responses that you're giving. I'm just looking at the time, and it's really fast spent. I know we started a bit late, but we would still appreciate if we could end within the stipulated time. Let me just run one question here, which would be really good if we could answer it very, very quickly. It's still very technical, but I find it very interesting, and it would be good for clarity to be said. So the CDM aims to issue conservative amounts of CERs, and the NDC, on the other hand, requires accurate accounting. How will the gap between conservative approach and accurate accounting be bridged? So the question is about, like, if the SB has been developed for usage for CERs, which is conservative accounting, and we are now talking about using it in the NDC process, which requires accurate accounting. How do we reconcile these two disparities in approach? I still wanted to stick with you, Professor, if you could first have a go at it, and maybe we could.
Yes, you have a conservative approach so that you are safe when it comes to counting the actual carbon credits. Because if you are overambitious, you may not be able to meet the targets. So I prefer to have a conservative approach because of the meeting of the targets when counting starts.
Okay.
And just, sorry, John, just to add to just Professor, I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. I mean, it's like, I fully agree with what Professor just said, that because conservative approach in the context of NDCs is also from the point of whether it is in the interest of the country also, that whether it supports avoiding overselling of the credits also. I mean, it's like, so I mean, both are required and both will be applied in different contexts, and so I don't think they both are exclusive in the context of Paris Agreement. Yeah.
Can I say something on that, John, as well?
Yes, Gloria, please.
Okay, the NDC accounting procedures require countries to come up with their own MRV systems that will help them in the reporting. So the flexibility we have under the Paris Agreement, I think it gives leeway for countries to come up with their own systems for accounting. And I think what is important here is to see, as we've discussed, how the accounting procedures are in light of for instance, the bio and update reports, because we see many countries are grappling with that. Communication under Article 4, the transparency requirements under the Paris Agreement. So I think what is important right now is for countries to come up with robust MRV systems to support in the accounting, but also utilize the CDM methodologies that have been developed in the accounting processes, and also the standardized baseline. So it's about the linkages between all these different frameworks to enhance reporting on the NDCs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been very useful input from you as a panelist. Again, like I see, the time is really fast spent. This has been a very interesting discussion, but it can't definitely go on forever. I want to hand over back to Suri, and if there is some more time, perhaps Suri, you could treat some of the questions if you find that if it's possible. But for me, I would like to send my thanks to the panel and thank all the panelists for their input. It's been very, very useful. Back to you.
I'm sorry for coming late. Really, I was confused with time. I apologize, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
No problem. I think in the event, everything is turning out quite well. We still have a couple of minutes until 4 o'clock. A few more slides to go through. So I think we've treated the question and answer session already. So I see there's another Mentimeter slide coming up. So I'd like to actually hand it back to Sana and Brenda, because while we're coming to the end here, we're also collecting some ideas for any future webinars, and we've got some multiple choices here, I think. So Brenda and Sana, would you like to take us through those? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Suri. So soon you should be able to see the last Mentimeter question. Can you all see it on the screen now? So our last question is, what would be your preferred topic for our future webinar? And we have given you a couple of options. The first one is implementation of the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. One is national MRV systems. The third is focused session on technical specific SBs, such as, for example, power sector, non-renewable biomass, or buildings. And then the fourth one is for you to propose another topic you would have in mind that you would like to get a webinar on. And you can continue answering. We have already 8 answers from our participants, but please submit your answers. And for the fourth one, if you have another topic in mind, I'd like to let you know that we're also going to send all the webinar participants survey afterwards. And then you will be able to specify what kind of another topic you would suggest us to organize a webinar on. I see the number is going up now. 15 people have given their answers to this question. Thank you very much for that. And it seems that the most popular option is national MRV systems, but the implementation of the ETF is actually coming second. Maybe we'll give a couple of more moments for rest of our participants to submit. Eighteen of you have submitted your answers, and still the national MRV systems has the first place. I think this gives quite a good overview of our participants' opinion at this point, but yeah, just remember you still have an opportunity to suggest topics when you're doing the survey we're going to send you afterwards. So I would like to give the floor back to Suri now.
Thanks a lot, Sana, and we'll save those inputs for later when we're developing further ideas. And also with that, I'd like to thank everyone for contributing and participating in the webinar. I've really learned a lot and found the discussions really interesting. So I think I'd like to ask everyone, if possible, to turn on their cameras and also to unmute themselves, and we can give a round of applause to all of the panelists and the other people that contributed, because it can be quite tiring to speak into the void for 2 hours. So let's see who's all out there. Look, see, we're not alone. So then I'd like to just okay, thank you guys. So, and also I'll take this opportunity to take a screenshot. Just bear with me. And we can use that for later. Okay, there's lots of people out there. Okay, thank you. That's the family photo for this time. A little bit different than normal, but anyway. So I wanted to just before we left, I wanted to also give the opportunity to Bianca, if she's there, from the East Africa Alliance on carbon. Hi, Bianca, carbon markets and climate finance. She's got a webinar planned for the end of the month. So, Bianca, would you like to take the floor and just mention some words about that? It's end of July, actually, not end of this month.
Yes,
sorry.
yes. Thank you, Suri. I hope everyone can hear me just fine. I won't take long since we're at the end of this. As Gloria has already touched on the Alliance, our main aim is to ensure long-term participation in carbon markets and the mobilization of climate finance. So I'm pleased to announce we'll be having our first event on climate finance on the 29th of July next month. We'll share the information on our website. I'll put it on the chat information, and we'll send out the information through the mailing list and the newsletter as well. And yes, please look at the website to just get a bit more information on the Alliance, and feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Bianca. So we're going to follow up with a survey on the webinar, how you found the experience, and that's going to be in the last step. So thank you again, everyone, very much for your participation, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, Suri.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel.